Well, hello and welcome to Insight with political tours and beyond the headlines. Amid all the focus on the pandemic, Brexit's economic impact on the UK seems to have gone relatively unnoticed. While Boris and co have taken back control, some of the costs are beginning to emerge, from additional custom checks and other red tape to banks moving their businesses overseas. Today, we're going to explore that in a bit more depth with two great guests. They are Maddy Thimont Jack, who leads the Institute for Government's Brexit team and is also a co-author of a new report by the Institute on Brexit. Hello, Maddy.
Sorry, I was on mute. Hello, thanks for having me.
I was wondering what
I was wondering. To start.
Yeah. I was wondering what was happening there. We're also joined by a political tours regular, Peter Glanville, who owns a cheese import business in the UK, as well as two pubs and a horse or two. He's here to give us a brief overview of a small business trading with the EU. Hello, Peter.
Hello to everyone. I'm in Cheltenham, UK, and it's great to be part of this.
Wonderful. I'm really looking forward to this. It's worth noting here that Boris Johnson's government prioritised sovereignty and the ability to write our own rules and regulations for our own economy over and above access to the EU's market. So while British firms exporting or importing to and from the EU don't have to pay extra tariffs, they do actually face considerable non-tariff barriers. And this is the key to understanding the UK's trade with the EU. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with Peter just to talk about the experience of a business, and then we can sort of expand out a bit with Maddy just to see what's going on overall. So Peter, just to start with, tell us what your business actually does before saying what the impact has been to the business since January. So just tell us what you do.
Okay, I wholesale cheese and other associated products, cooked meats, charcuterie, olives, to small independent retailers and farm shops, some restaurants and some hotels. And I do that on a weekly basis, weekly cycles. We deliver each week. So the whole business is done on a weekly cycle. I import products from France principally, but some that's cheese and some meats from Italy. Once again, on a weekly cycle.
Okay, so nearly all of your products are coming from the EU into the UK, and then you're distributing that within the UK. And previously, as we all know, since the single market was created, that those foodstuffs would just basically come on lorries, on trucks, and there would be nothing to stop them. They'd come straight across the channel and straight to your business, and you distribute them. Just tell us a bit more about in the lead up to January the 1st, you did have warnings, didn't you? You said that you needed to get your business ready. What did you actually expect? What were you expecting at that point?
Just one thing, it's not 100%, it's about 50% are imported products. The other 50% are UK sourced. In the run up to Jan the 1st, 2021, really, I couldn't get much detailed information, only general information. I guess that was because we didn't have a firm deal, but we registered with the government, basically the same as you register for VAT, and then sort of viewed the government website, but it was very general. And I was reassured by my principal transport company, don't worry, we'll look after you. We'll have it sussed with agents for you. Well, I wasn't quite confident with that. So I did appoint my own agent and registered, as I've already said, with the government. But that was about it. I couldn't get any detailed information. I saw "We're ready, are you ready?" videos being put out, but I couldn't. I said, okay, what do I actually have to do once I place the order? What do I do? I couldn't get any detailed information. Right. So okay. I took the view, we'll wait and see.
Okay, so you did wait, and then what did you see, and what have you had to do? What has been the difficulty?
The principal difficulty was not only I didn't know, but not many other people seemed to know either. So we did nothing for 2 to 3, I think it was 3 weeks into January. Fortunately, it's a quiet time of the year, so it didn't impact too much, but it impacted when we ran out of products. And by then we'd let other people make a few mistakes. So I then found out that we had to have far more detailed information than just an invoice. Previously, I could buy from Paris the same as I could buy from Birmingham. No problem. The only was logistics getting it here, and they went very well. Or on order on a Thursday, arrive on my depot for Monday morning. Perfect. However, now we have to order at least a week in advance of that, just to enable the supplier to list all the detail that they have to list, which for my particular business, with anything up to 40 or 50 products on one pallet, is a lot of work. And people made mistakes, but we've gradually got over that. And the biggest problem we have now is simply the time lag. So
what is that time lag, Peter? And can you sort of put an estimation in terms of costs as well?
Yeah, so say from order on a Thursday to receive on a Monday, 4 or 5 days. It's now the week on top of that, so it's 11, 12, 13 days. The problem with that is you can't respond to customers' needs so quickly. They've got to wait too long for special orders. Stock items you're taking more of a risk with, so it leads to greater waste. Sell-by dates are a problem. It's just much more difficult.
And so, and when you say waste, you're essentially saying, you know, cheese or whatever's been thrown away because it's just been sitting around for too long.
Well, some items, particularly soft cheese, or have a very short sell-by date, maybe something like 3-4 weeks. Well, if there's 2 weeks of that gone by the time I get it, and then I have to send it out to my retail customer, and there's maybe only 7-8 days, they're not best pleased.
Yeah, and you're absorbing those costs? Who's absorbing the costs of that? I presume the exporter is having to spend a lot of time with the paperwork sending stuff to the UK, and he's got to decide, or he or she's got to decide whether that's worth it as well.
That's a very good point. I'm picking up, although nobody's said it to me directly, they are certainly less enthusiastic. We're still early days, but I'm picking that up. They seem to, and why wouldn't they be? They can send stuff to Germany or Italy very easily, but UK, it's a considerable amount of more administration work for them to do.
Okay, I guess you know, the government say this is, you know, we've got our sovereignty, there's additional bureaucracy, there are additional costs, and maybe that's going to improve in time. Thank you very much for that introduction there, Peter. We're going to turn to Maddy now, just to get us a broader overview of what's happening across the whole sector. I'm going to delay the question on how typical Pete's experience is for a moment, Maddy, but can you just talk about the current relationship between the UK and the EU? Obviously, the negotiations were very, you know, right up to the wire. How has that relationship gone since January the 1st?
Yeah, well, I think it might not surprise some of the people on the call to hear that things have been quite bumpy, to be honest. I mean, I think I was one of many people who thought that if there was a deal, if we did get an agreement with the EU, that would sort of turn a new page on the UK-EU relationship, and actually they could sort of try and work together productively on sort of shared areas of interest going forward. But I mean, I don't think I can say that's definitely not going to happen, but it definitely hasn't happened, or it's been more tricky than maybe some of us thought so far. And there are a few reasons for that. I mean, the one thing, and I think, again, some people might have noticed or picked up on this, you know, there's obviously been tension around vaccines. So that's sort of separate really to Brexit, but that has been a sort of one of the sort of tensions around the EU wanting, being concerned about AstraZeneca exporting more vaccines to the UK than they are to the EU, and the sort of tension around contracts. And so that's been sort of one issue, although it's sort of died down now. And I think the fact that the EU vaccine rollout is now sort of really starting to pick up, I think, has helped. But there's also been the ongoing problems and tensions around Northern Ireland and the special arrangements that the UK and the EU agreed for Northern Ireland to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland. And there have been some tensions around how that's been applied, whether the UK is actually going to fulfill its obligations, whether the EU is being too hardline, and that's sort of been an ongoing tension. I think if we sort of take a sort of step back, I think part of the reason for this, you know, on the UK side, if we're looking at the politics, particularly of the Conservative Party, the one thing that we know all Conservative MPs, at least this sort of group of MPs currently in Parliament, agree on, is that Brexit is a good thing, and they're quite anti the EU. So sort of EU bashing essentially is quite a good political tool, particularly when the government was struggling with coronavirus. It sort of was a bit of a rallying cry, I think, for Conservative MPs. There is a sort of very strong desire from this government to prove that Brexit was worth it. So with the vaccines, for example, they really wanted to say, well, the reason we could do it differently was because we're outside the EU. Now, that's not technically true, but it's quite a good political narrative. And then I think on the EU side, there is a real clear desire to show, and particularly to member states and those member states which might have quite Eurosceptic populations, that actually it is worse being outside the EU than it is being inside the EU. And so I think that has fueled some of the sort of general tensions that we have seen over sort of the preceding few months. I mean, I would say, you know, there are some very clear sort of shared challenges that the UK and the EU will want to work together on, particularly, for example, climate change. But I think that we haven't quite got to a sort of steady state of relations. And actually, the one thing I haven't mentioned, which has been dominating the front pages in the UK today, is around Jersey and the French fishermen. There are some French fishermen who are very annoyed that they don't have access to the waters that they did have before Brexit. And there has been definite escalation of tension between the UK government and the French ministers over that issue. So there are clearly these issues just aren't quite resolved yet.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, as we speak, I think Boris Johnson has sent 2 coastal patrol boats, Royal Naval vessels, from Falmouth to Jersey. And the French trawlermen are talking about there's a talk of a possible blockade of St Helier port, Jersey's main port. It does seem ridiculous. And also French ministers talking about the possibility of cutting off electricity to Jersey, and that's sort of tied up in the negotiations over the fish. It does seem, you know, pretty absurd. And I think possibly the other point to note is that Lord Frost, you know, very tough negotiator, was given a senior cabinet position within Johnson's government. I guess that sent another signal that you know, Britain's going to be tough with the EU.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. And I mean, it's quite interesting because Lord Frost was obviously the lead negotiator on both the withdrawal agreements, the sort of exit treaty, and the future relationship agreement that we now have. And so, you know, he was quite hardline. We did see some moves, particularly last September, when the UK threatened to break international law to try and get more out of the EU. You know, I think there's a sense that he was one of the people who was behind that and thought that would be a good thing to try and get the EU to move. We won't ever know whether that worked or not, to be perfectly honest. The EU are never going to say that actually made them concede anything. The UK will always say that it was a very sensible and that's how they got the deal they did. We don't know, but we know that he was very willing to be quite hardline. And I think that that's also one of the problems relating to Northern Ireland, is that actually with Northern Ireland being hardline hasn't been very positive. I mean, it's essentially given fuel to unionist opposition to the protocol, and actually it's having quite a destabilizing effect on the political structures in Northern Ireland. So I think that we have seen Lord Frost be very willing to be hardline with the EU, but possibly isn't being as sensitive to what the implications might be domestically for doing so.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Northern Ireland just a bit. 2 days ago, we had a discussion about the political impact of the Northern Ireland Protocol on the medium-term future, and it's obviously quite worrying then in terms of the politics. But I'd love to hear more about how that protocol actually works in a minute. But let's just talk about the details of what we know so far. It is Pete's story typical of an importer? And also, can you talk about the other sectors? Because obviously that sort of agri-business is quite specific. So just give us a flavour of some of the businesses and how they've been affected.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really interesting to hear Pete's experience. And I think that particularly for sort of smaller businesses, I think that's really accurate, where I think a lot of people didn't have the information, the tailored information about what the end of the year would mean for them, but also didn't necessarily have experience of trading outside of the EU before. So also weren't used to having to think about sort of customs declarations and tariffs and all of those sorts of things that come with trading outside of the single market. So I think that that is quite accurate. And again, I think on the agri-food point, I think, again, as you said, that has been one of the sectors hardest hit. When you're looking at the sort of reduction in trade, the trade stats are still, it's quite early days and they're quite difficult to see what they actually will mean in the long term. But definitely agri-food has remained much lower than other trading goods. So I think that definitely sort of reflects that sector, I think. I think what's difficult about what we can say at this stage is that it's still quite uncertain what the impact of Brexit actually is. And I mentioned those trade stats. You know, one of the challenges of trying to interpret what the trade stats in January and February actually say is that we know some businesses stockpiled, so particularly those businesses without perishable goods. So Pete's already explained to us why he couldn't stockpile soft cheese, but other sectors, so if you think about manufacturing sectors like cars and aviation, they can actually stockpile more of their goods. So we might have seen a drop in trade, but actually didn't necessarily have a knock-on impact on production. The other thing that's quite difficult to disentangle is that over time, so if we talk about a sort of an industry or sectors that don't get as much attention as those in, for example, the services industries, and actually what's going to be quite difficult to track is where, for example, a firm that operates across maybe multiple member states and also has a base in London, what won't be as easy to see is when they've made a choice to invest more, say, for example, in their base in Portugal or in Amsterdam or in Paris, and they haven't invested as much in London. There'll be a sort of shift over time, but it won't sort of appear in statistics that we can see sort of day to day. And so I think it's quite tricky to sort of actually understand exactly what the impact will be. And I think Pete also explained, you know, his experience of not doing anything in January, waiting to see what would happen and then getting a better sense of how things will operate before making certain business decisions. And that's also going to be the case for other sectors too, where they'll have to work out what the new costs actually will be on a permanent basis and then make business decisions accordingly. I mean, the other thing I would add to that is actually, I mean, Pete talked about exporters from the EU being maybe less keen to export to the UK. I think it's worth saying that the UK hasn't actually implemented full border controls yet. So that's happening next January. So the cheese that Pete's talking about doesn't have to go through border control posts until next year. And that's going to be an added layer of hassle for those exporters that they will have to think about whether they want to actually do that or not. So there's still quite a lot of sort of uncertainty. And then the final bit of uncertainty I would just add is the pandemic. You know, some industries have been closed in the UK essentially for nearly 4 months. They haven't had to actually grapple with what the consequences of Brexit will mean. And I mean, immigration is one example of that, but also, you know, I heard someone talk about, for example, swimming pools have been closed. They haven't had to worry about getting the chemicals they need from the EU until swimming pools opened up again. And there are those sorts of sectors that we haven't necessarily, all the sort of sectors that were impacted by pandemic that haven't then had to think about what Brexit means. And so again, it's going to be quite a long tail, I think, through the rest of the year.
Okay, and just to add to that, I mean, as you've hinted, a lot of the measures that would be introduced on both sides have been deferred, and you're not just talking about customs controls here. There's regulatory frameworks as well that haven't been implemented yet.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's mainly on the UK side where basically the UK government has appreciated it's been really difficult for businesses to sort of prepare for Brexit. So there's a sort of decision to recognise EU regulatory requirements for a period of time on any goods sold on the British market. And so if the UK government does decide at some point to enforce controls and say, no, you must meet the new UK requirements, then you're looking at having to duplicate what you're doing for your products if you're selling in the EU and in the UK or in GB, Great Britain, then that's additional costs again. And so then you have to make decisions. Do you want to, if you're based in Great Britain, do you want to sell into the EU market? And if you're based in the EU, you make a decision, do you want to still continue to sell into the GB market?
Okay, so let's just try and recap a bit, because it's quite confusing to the uninitiated like me. Certainly there are more controls to be implemented than they've been deferred.
Yeah.
There is certainly a significant amount of added bureaucracy and paperwork if you're importing things. But as yet, a lot of those controls have not been implemented. Is that just very briefly, that's sort of fair to summarize?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary.
Okay, so then let's look at a couple of areas where things are the impact's a bit clearer so far. Banks, financial services contribute a huge amount to the UK revenue. As yet, there's no agreement on financial services, but we've already seen that many banks have actually shifted their businesses abroad, and also there's been a significant loss in trade. Can you talk briefly about that?
Yeah, so as you've mentioned, I mean, so one of the things that we were waiting for to see was whether the EU would deem the UK's financial services regulatory regime sort of equivalent, is the sort of technical term, where basically they recognise the standards and say, okay, we'll sort of continue to treat you as we did before. It's worth flagging that even that was going to be a lot. It would still reduce the amount of access that financial services firms had to the single market. It doesn't replace what you have if you're part of the EU, but it would have made it a bit easier to continue to sell and trade with the EU as they did in some areas before. That hasn't happened yet. And I think a lot of people have seen it really as a political move by the EU. There isn't really a reason to not recognise the UK's regulatory regime, because actually it was previously recognised as an EU member state and things haven't necessarily changed yet. So there is a bit of frustration on that. And I think quite a few people now think that probably won't happen, and we won't get that recognition. As you say, some banks have moved some of their activity into the EU, but I think it is worth saying that the financial services sector, and I'm not an expert in financial services, I will preface this, but it covers a broad range of activity. It's not just the activity that we conduct with the EU. And actually, when you speak to some people in the sector, they say they're much more worried about what's going on in Singapore and Hong Kong than they are about what's going on in the EU and trying to continue to access the EU market. So it's not a sort of blanket picture, but I would say that we have seen some shifts. What's interesting, though, is that the fact that we haven't got this equivalence regime does give the government more opportunity to do things differently, because they're not worried about getting that. They know that they're not going to get that equivalence, they're not going to get that recognition. So actually, it does mean the government could tailor the sort of financial services regime more specifically to the UK market, and to actually try and make the UK look more sort of desirable, particularly thinking about its competition with banks outside the EU, so in the US or in Asia. So it's a sort of an interesting picture there, where it sort of doesn't look great on day one, but actually that could change. And that's sort of an interesting opportunity to sort of try and take things further.
Okay, I'd love to start getting questions from people. The Q&A box, bottom right-hand side of my screen, maybe elsewhere on yours. Just start typing your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll start bringing your questions up. One thing that really struck me, and I know this is partly to do with the pandemic, but I also think to do with Brexit, is the number of people who were previously EU citizens who came to the UK to work. And they might have been, in restaurant services, the services sector, or working in agriculture. Significant amounts of those people have moved, to elsewhere in the EU or back home. What's the impact of that? I mean, what impact does that have?
No, I think it's really interesting to see. And I did look up, and I think the ONS statistics, the statistics body in the UK, estimated about 1 million people left the UK over the last year. And as you say, some of it is pandemic related. It's not all EU citizens, but it is definitely a significant chunk of the UK workforce. And I do know sort of anecdotally that there are quite a few, particularly Eastern Europeans, have left over the last year or so, and some since the EU referendum vote. They don't feel welcome here, so then they don't want to stay. What it does mean is, particularly for those sectors like hospitality, now we were just talking about the impact of the pandemic. In the UK, restaurants and pubs and bars have been closed for nearly 4 months, so actually they haven't needed high staff, you know, and that might have also fueled people leaving because there aren't the jobs to do while everything's shut. But now everything's opening up, there is a real challenge actually getting sufficient staff, both in terms of waiters and waitresses, but also chefs, because we actually relied a lot on EU citizens to do those jobs. And I do think that as restaurants open up, particularly in the UK anyway, in a couple of weeks time, they're going to be, or in England, sorry, definitely a couple of weeks time, they'll be open sort of for indoor service as well as outdoor service. And a lot of places are really struggling to get sufficient staff. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the UK government responds to that. And it actually might have to reconsider its current immigration system.
Because of course that affects labour costs, and you know, many businesses will be trading on the fact that they can pay, you know, if you've got Eastern European employees, you know, that you've been able to pay slightly lower salaries than you might do otherwise. I mean, one might argue, well, that's a good thing, it increases wages, but there is an economic consequence to this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the sort of area where I think we've been particularly reliant on sort of Eastern European labour is definitely in agriculture. As you say, you know, there's a sort of suggestion of, well, won't young Brits go and pick the fruit on the farms? But they don't seem to want to do that. So I think there is going to be, you know, the government will either have to try and incentivise UK labour to pick up those jobs. And there might be, because obviously the economic impact of the pandemic still is unfolding, there might be a few more people looking for work, so they could work in hospitality. But we still don't really know, and the government's going to have to be very alive to that and think through what those consequences are.
Okay, we'll talk about Northern Ireland in just a bit, but let's get the conversation going. Simon Jackson, as ever, with great questions there. Simon, go ahead with your question.
So what that is useful have we taken back control?
That is a very good question. I mean, it depends what your version of useful is. If we look at it sort of slightly, we've taken back control of a lot of our laws. I think the sort of, if you're looking at it from the positive balance sheet, what it means is that the UK can be more reactive to local, so we can regulate in a way that's more attuned to the interests and needs of the UK rather than having to act as a bloc. So actually some of the like EU laws around, for example, agriculture, actually the government is choosing to do sort of take a very different approach within England anyway, where it has control, and is trying to sort of tailor it more to the needs or the perceived needs or political priorities of England. So that's, I guess, one example. I mentioned financial services, where there is a hope that particularly in fintech, there's actually a chance for the UK to be a sort of global leader in that. So that's sort of another sort of benefit. I mean, on the vaccines point, what I do think is interesting is that even if the MHRA, the UK's medical regulator, could have made the decision to approve vaccines sooner than the rest of the EU, even if we were a member state, there is a question about whether politically we would have done that. So there is a sort of political change where you actually don't need to try and get agreement, or you feel the pressure to act as 28, you can act as one. So that's a sort of, on the, I guess, positive balance sheet. But obviously, as we've kind of discussed, doing that definitely has come with some quite significant costs. There are obviously new trade barriers with the EU, and that's, you know, it's not. It sort of slightly depends how you look at it, essentially. Yeah. Like,
Maddy, I'm going to pin you down, because
okay,
we've talked about the difficulty of assessing those costs. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether it's the ONS or the I can't remember which government body predicts a 4% loss of GDP over the next, I think, 15 years, 10 years.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, where some people say, well, that's fine, but you're still saying, look, okay, there's a significant bureaucratic impact on trade, but we just really can't tell what the actual financial cost is at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. I think it was the OBR that did that, the estimation. But yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that essentially this is it's a very unique trade agreement. Normally, trade agreements bring two countries closer together, and they're about removing barriers to trade. This agreement was all about erecting barriers to trade, and that's part of the reason why economists have struggled so much to model the impact, because they don't actually have sort of other scenarios that they can, or other examples that they can feed into their machine. They're having to estimate what these costs might be, and that's made it much harder. So, I mean, I think that the reality is that there will be a cost, but obviously this government and 52% of the UK believe that that cost was worth it to actually bring decision making closer to the people.
And
now, as I say, there's a question about whether it's a political question really about whether you think it's
and there are a lot more costs to come. These costs are evolving, and the regulation that's going to be implemented and the checks are not all there yet. I did have a question for Peter Glanville, but Andy Mendes is going to ask it for me instead. Go ahead, Andy.
That's a first, Nicholas. I'm asking the same question as you.
Taking the words out of my mouth.
Yeah. Peter, you said at the beginning in your introduction that you'd been fighting through some of the paperwork, but as I understand it, you were fairly uninformed as to what was going on. At some point in the future, we'll be introducing import tariffs and new import regulations. I just wondered, how much information have you had about that at this point from the government? How prepared are they, and how good is the West Country at growing olives?
Yes, well, I mean, with climate change, who knows? We could soon be growing olives. But actually, very little. I'm not saying it's not there, but I haven't sorted out because maybe I'm not doing the planning I should be doing, but we're too busy just coping with what we've got. That, I mean, as Maddy was saying, we haven't got an idea of what the costs are really. All I can estimate something like an increase of 20 to 25%, but I haven't imposed those on my customers yet because
Pete, how are you going to deal with that? Because I mean, your margins, if you're trading with food, I mean, the margins are small, aren't they? I mean, you're not making huge,
oh, no.
certainly not taking 25%. So what's going to happen?
Well, we're going to have to, but the worst thing you can do is implement some costs and then you realize, oh, there are others, and you've got to implement them as well. So I'm waiting for another month or so I know all the costs, because they're appearing. I'm getting extra invoices from my agent saying I should have charged you. It's impossible to be specific at this time. So the one thing customers don't like is price rises, but they dislike price rises followed by other very quick price rises. So yes, at the moment I am suffering through lack of profitability, but I believe it's the right thing to do for longer term relationships.
Okay, and are you and you've had your business for some time. I mean, is there a risk? I mean, at some point do you make a calculation and you think, okay, well, I've got employees, I want to support them, but really this business is not viable?
No, I don't think that will be the case, and I hope I haven't given that impression. We're fairly resilient. There have been problems, but we're still here, we're still trading, and there are problems. They're not as perhaps as bad as what we thought they were going to be.
Okay, that's great to hear.
It's not all bad news, and we have to cope with these things, and in general we will do somehow. I don't quite know how specifically at the moment, but we will. We always have.
Right. Okay. So you're not switching all your attention to the horses just yet.
No. Well, I've got to have something to do in my spare time.
Right. Excellent. Okay, Maddy. Let's turn to that thorny subject now, and that's the Northern Ireland Protocol. Just to remind people, why is there a trade border down the Irish Sea? I mean, and what does that mean in practical terms?
So essentially, the Northern Ireland Protocol came about because there was an agreement between the UK and the EU right at this relatively towards the start of the negotiations, actually back in 2017, that there shouldn't be a hard border on the island of Ireland. Now that it's sort of for a couple of reasons. I mean, the big reason is because previously any infrastructure on the border would be perceived to be sort of vulnerable to attack from paramilitary groups. So there was a real recognition of the sort of historical context of Northern Ireland, the political situation there, and a desire to not destabilise relationship between the unionist and nationalist communities there, sort of in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement. It was also because the island didn't want to be outside of the EU single market. So Ireland still wanted to be able to move goods freely from Ireland into the EU single market, but the EU is incredibly concerned about goods entering the single market that do not meet its requirements. So they sort of said, look, if goods are moving freely from Republic of Ireland, there needs to be a border somewhere to check that they meet, that any goods from the UK basically would meet those requirements if they're moving into the EU. Now, I think it's important to say, so Theresa May had one way of dealing with it, and that was essentially to keep the whole of the UK in the customs union with the EU. So that meant you wouldn't have any customs declarations. It would mean you wouldn't have to have customs checks on the island of Ireland. It also would mean that you wouldn't need customs checks moving from Great Britain into Northern Ireland or into the EU. And then she also said she'd make a commitment to align with the EU in certain key rules where you'd need extra checks, and that's specifically on agri-food. So Theresa May came up with her solution to this problem. The Conservative Party obviously rejected that, including the Labour Party, and Parliament refused to pass that deal. Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, and he essentially said, we want to have a Brexit that allows us to strike free trade agreements, to take back control of our rules. So therefore, we won't be part of the customs union and we will not follow EU rules, which returned to this question of, well, what do you then do to avoid that border on the island of Ireland? And what they ended up doing is to have that regulatory and customs border in the Irish Sea. So any goods moving, so Northern Ireland has to continue to follow EU rules in key areas regulating goods. And then any goods entering Northern Ireland from Great Britain need to have the checks to make sure that they are following those rules, so that there's no chance that sort of any goods of a lower quality, for example, would get into the EU single market. And that's essentially, hopefully that makes sense as how we got here.
That's a really good explanation of the chronology of it. But now here we have a situation. So if you're going to if Tesco's is going to take cheddar made in the southwest of England and to Northern Ireland, what has to happen to it?
So, well, at the moment, nothing at the moment, because there are some sort of waivers on these checks. But in theory, under the protocol, they would need to fill out export health certificates. They'd have to comply. There would have to be checks at border control posts, and they'd also have to fill out paperwork setting out sort of customs arrangements. And it's worth saying that there's an agreement within the protocol to say that basically most goods don't have to pay tariffs if they're moving from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, but if they are at risk of moving into the EU single market, then they would, and then there's an option for the UK government to pay the company back. But essentially what we're looking at is a border that looks very similar to the border between Great Britain and the EU, between Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Tariffs, so they don't have to pay an additional tax. They have to comply with.
So some goods would, because of the way that the sort of border works, is that some goods that flow from Great Britain into Northern Ireland then go into Ireland and onto the EU single market. So those goods would have to comply with would have to pay tariffs. But there was an agreement to waive. And so there was a concern essentially that that some goods could make it into Northern Ireland and then sneak into the EU without paying tariffs that they should be paying. And so there was an agreement between the UK and the EU around basically ensuring that about 95% of goods moving across the Irish Sea won't have to pay tariffs. There's a sort of trust that they will not be entering the single market, but that is one of the concerns that the EU had.
I'm a bit confused with that. I thought it was just restricted to sort of veterinary inspections and making sure you can.
Some goods have to pay tariffs, but as I say, it's any goods that are at risk of moving on into the EU single market, and then if you can prove that the good didn't go into the EU, then you can get you'll get the rebate.
This is all so confusing. It's all the nitty-gritty of trade, you know, and whoever ever have thought we'd be having these kind of conversations. But the point is that this does have significant political impacts. As we were discussing 2 days ago, unionists really do feel as though they're in a corner. They see it as affecting their sovereignty. And we're going, this summer in Northern Ireland looks like it's going to be a pretty tricky one with quite violent protests possibly emerging in July. And the people we spoke to on Tuesday were not optimistic about the immediate future.
No,
let's take some more questions. Lynn Maddock. Lynn, just say where you are. I think most of us know, but for those who don't, say where you are and tell us your question. You need to open your microphone, Lynn, which I suspect is on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, which is currently off. Microphone, it says it's the microphone symbol. It says mute. If you just need to press that and unmute it, I may get Isabel to request that your microphone is open. So we're struggling with Lynn's sound. I hope we can get it back, but she's written a question here, so I'll put it for Pete, and Lynn knows Pete from our various travels. Lynn, by the way, has in the background, her training is she's an economist and has worked with the Australian government. Pete, some time ago, you talked about how you're putting off new capital investment, new vehicles, etc. Have you picked up your spending in that area? And if not, does that mean your capital equipment is becoming degraded and possibly therefore less productive? So that's a true question from an economist. Lynn, are you there? You're there. Yeah, you can talk now. Go on.
Thank you, Nicholas. You did it very well.
Okay, excellent. And where are you? Just
Hi,
remind me.
Pete.
Where?
I'm in Melbourne.
In Melbourne, excellent. And what time is it in Melbourne now?
It's about 9:30 at night.
9:30. Civilized.
Absolutely.
Civilized. Pete.
Hi, Lynn. Nice to hear you.
Hi, Pete.
Yeah, no, I'm pleased to report that no, I have put my reluctant invest behind me, and in fact, I'm reasonably confident about the future. And we haven't actually purchased 2 new vans recently, so you know, I'm doing my bit for capital investment, or whatever you economists call it, anyway. So no, I am reasonably optimistic about the future. There are problems, but I'm sure we'll overcome them. We've overcome problems in the past, and fortunately, like any good businesses, we have a little bit of reserves to fall back on to see us over these slightly less profitable times. So
yeah.
I'm
going to put a question to Lynn here, because we do like sort of bringing in sort of many voices here. I mean, I think commentators around the world have said, and Maddy indicated too, why, you know, this is the first trade agreement that actually makes things worse for our traders. But having said that, Lynn, what would you, if you were going to advise the British government, what would you tell them to focus on? Where do you think there is potential, to answer Simon Jackson's question? If you're going to take back control, what can you do with it, Lynn?
If I was British government, I'd resign, Nicholas, but that's probably not the answer you were looking for. It's always been very opaque to me what the benefits are. I mean, it's not border controls. I mean, in terms of people, it appears from afar that you've got the potential to lose out very badly on the services side. So no, I find it really hard to tell what you'd focus on. I mean, I guess what they're likely to focus on is promoting British manufacturing and you know, British cheddar makers and that sort of thing, to try to use the domestic market to grow, to replace what will be some diminution of the imports levels. That's all I can think of.
Yeah, which you would argue creates sort of large inefficiencies in your own economy, and you eventually lag behind others.
Absolutely. I mean, I think everyone's accepted that there's going to be a productivity impact, a negative productivity impact of the Brexit changes. Yeah.
Okay. Maddy, are those comments fair? Do you think that's, I mean, where can you, what is the government focusing on? Where do they think there is that? I mean, we talked about financial services and the greater flexibility there. I mean, what else are they thinking?
I mean, they're also quite interested in regulation of AI, artificial intelligence, and I think they see that as an opportunity for the UK to sort of lead the way on doing that. As I say, I do think that they are quite excited about being able to regulate agriculture in a different way. Farmers might not necessarily agree with their approach, but the idea is to really focus on environmental benefits in a way that actually the EU's common agriculture policy was quite clunky, because you had a lot of different interests that didn't really do that much. I mean, they'd spent, I think half the EU's budget is spent on agricultural support. So I think the UK government is hoping to be able to sort of do that in more efficient ways. And so there was discussion, particularly when Michael Gove was Environment Secretary, of a sort of green Brexit. And this is an opportunity to, you know, again, it's not necessarily about doing things you couldn't do within the EU, although some of that is true, but it's about the sort of mentality and approach of the UK government and try and be a bit of a world leader in those areas. The one thing actually, I was just thinking while Lynn was talking, that maybe addresses Simon's question of a sort of a benefit from Brexit. Now, what I see as a sort of political benefit is that I think over the last 20 years or longer, the UK politicians have always been able to outsource blame for things that go wrong to the EU. And that's part of the reason I think that the country did end up voting for Brexit. You know, there was a sort of dislike of European bureaucrats imposing rules from Brussels that we didn't have a say in, even if that didn't necessarily accurately reflect the lawmaking process. But now the government won't be able to do that. So the one way of seeing it is that we're taking back control of our laws, but we're also, our politicians are taking back control of sort of blame, essentially responsibility and culpability for the choices that they're making. And I do wonder whether that is a sort of, even if you're someone who wasn't pro-Brexit, that can be seen as a benefit of actually, we now, you know, politicians are making decisions in Westminster and they will not be able to blame the EU anymore. Although over the last few months, obviously there's still a bit of an attempt to blame things on the EU. So that might take a few more years to bed in.
Yeah, part of the consequences we've been looking at is that governments in Cardiff and Edinburgh arguing for taking back control and blaming Westminster. So it's a cascade, I think.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, I think the SNP very much play the same game north of the border of England. So yes, I think that is true.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a few more questions coming in. So Harold Walker, Hookie, you've got a question there. You'll need to, it's the microphone, there we go, which is the key thing, is to work out. There we go, I think we've got you there. Go ahead, Hookie. I can't hear you yet. It seems like your microphone is open. So I'm gonna hope that your microphone opens and I'm gonna ask your question for you. In the sphere of agriculture, the UK can now develop GM, so genetically modified crops. Are there other fields where we can develop which we couldn't do before?
That's a good question. So I'm not an agricultural policy expert. I think you're right that GMOs have definitely been, is one of the areas that the UK is hoping to do things slightly differently. What I would flag about that is it introduces its own complexities, because that's an area that is devolved. So the UK government can make decisions around the cultivation of crops within England. Wales and Scotland can make their own decisions, and then Northern Ireland still has to follow EU rules. So that could be an area where actually there are different rules depending on which part of the UK you are operating within, and that can make it quite tricky in terms of trade within the UK of some of those crops. So that's to say, that's a sort of interesting case study in terms of the sort of challenges that have been raised for devolution as a result of Brexit. But I'm not sure if I can think of a specific area off the top of my head. As I said, I think the main thing that the government is keen to do is focus more on how farmers cultivate their land and give money according to that. I think there is a question about whether or not DEFRA, the department responsible for this, has the capability to do that, because it's actually a lot more complicated if farmers are applying for money on that basis. So I think there is a sort of sense of wanting to give like agricultural support more according to sort of different priorities than the EU had. But again, the challenge there is that Wales and Scotland have the freedom to do things differently, and they might want to give support based on a different basis. And also, a bit like with the EU, there are different agricultural needs depending on which part of the UK you're looking at. So agricultural needs in England is quite different to sort of sheep farming in Wales. So there's a sort of interesting question about how that is actually all resolved and managed. But yeah, I'm afraid I don't have another specific policy area that I can point to. I think GMOs would have been the one that I'd have picked up on.
Okay. Maddy, does anyone care? I mean, at this moment, we're all preoccupied with the pandemic. And at what point and when do people begin to care if you see bureaucracy sort of creeping into things? I mean, I can talk about, just from a personal perspective, but I want to buy something and import something. It might be, sometimes I collect antiques, and it's certainly very complicated. And I'm now no longer interested in buying anything from France. It's just too complicated to get it on a van and bring it over, find a customs agent, have somebody sort out, any sort of taxation side of things. And equally, if you want to import, some trainers from somebody in Spain or whatever, you've got additional charges through internet companies. At what point does this actually become a political issue?
I think it's a really interesting question. I'd actually be quite here. I'll share my thoughts, but I'm quite interested to hear Pete's view on this as well, as someone who's actually dealing with the impact of all of this. I think that your point about sort of importing from abroad, yeah, that's definitely something that I think is going to impact people. It's worth saying that the sort of how you pay, for example, for VAT will depend on whether the good is over £135 or not. So if you're buying something that's less than £135, you won't be slapped with quite the same charges if you import it into the country. So there's worth thinking about what you're paying. I think it also will really depend on how individual businesses and companies adapt. So for example, I bought sunglasses from Denmark a couple of months ago, and they actually on that web company website, they said, you know, this is the flat fee. We are going to just, that will cover all the costs, essentially, the import costs. So it might be some goods just increase in price a little bit, and those firms just say, we're going to charge you a little bit more, but we're going to cover everything, and you're not going to be charged anything on the doorstep when it arrives. So there's a bit of a question about how companies individually respond. I also think that the other thing that there's going to be a lot of hassle, and it will be for certain type of person, but pets, taking pets into the EU, you're now going to have to get an animal health certificate 10 days before you travel every single time. There are going to be some people, you know, if you've got your second home in France and you want to take your dog, if you've got to go to the vet every week to get a new animal health certificate, you're going to get quite frustrated by that bureaucracy. So it slightly depends, I think, who you are, how much you do engage with the EU, how much you travel, how much you do buy things from abroad. And I think that that's when the sort of irritation might come. But I do feel like because of the pandemic, because the impact hasn't been as severe as some people thought it might be, I think these annoyances are going to just become part of sort of everyday life, and we'll just get used to it, particularly if they're eased in over time. We haven't had a big bang of going, oh, suddenly I can't take my pet, or I've got to get 6 months of my passport, because we haven't been leaving our homes. So I think that because we've got this sort of gradual unlocking as a result of the pandemic, I think that probably has eased some of the burdens on people. So I think people are going to get a bit frustrated, but probably largely get on with it.
Yeah, and one of the things, I mean, that I guess it does. If you travel within the EU, and if you're in business in the EU, probably more prone to be in favour of it, but you're going to be more affected by it. So, I mean, perhaps you can just talk about the ability of Brits now to travel within the EU and what restrictions are upon them.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I think the key thing to note is that we no longer have sort of free movement rights. So we obviously can't just move to the EU if we want to for 6 months to a year and sort of be able to get a job and access relevant like social security benefits and things like that. So that's one thing. We'll have to comply with individual immigration arrangements. But even if we're visiting, there's now going to be a limit on how many days so we can only spend 90 out of 180 days in the Schengen area at a time. So again, if you have a second home, you're going to be limited to how long you can spend there. It's worth flagging that also if you're delivering services to the EU, there's now restrictions on exactly what you can do when you go there. And again, the day restrictions will also impact you. So if you're a firm that regularly sends your employees to deliver services in France or Germany, you're going to have to keep a track on how many days they're spending there, including their family holidays. So there's going to be extra sort of hassle there, although you will be able to sort of travel there relatively easily. We obviously aren't going to be in the EU line anymore for passport controls, but there will be a limit on how long you could spend there, which I think that will definitely impact certain firms and possibly individuals depending on their sort of general behaviour. Yeah,
travel firms included in all of that, but we're too small for it to be a problem. There are bigger firms for whom it is. Andy Mendes, you've raised your hand, so let's go back to Andy.
Yeah, it's really, we've spent 50 minutes failing to answer Simon's question about benefits. I don't think we've really heard of any benefits yet. I just wondered whether Maddy or Peter had a view as to whether either the UK, if we finally see sense, and or Scotland more likely, reapply to join. Would that be feasible? And what would be the barriers of doing that as far from both their perspectives?
This is the $60 million question, Maddy, isn't it? At Scotland, today, there's, for those that don't know, there's a parliamentary election in Scotland, and the SNP essentially says that if it gets a majority, it will hold a referendum on independence. So there could be another referendum soon, although the UK government says in Westminster says it's not going to agree to that. Maddy, you must have spent some time thinking about this. Scotland says it would be welcome with open arms, but it's more complicated than that.
Well, what I can say, we actually published a paper on this about a month ago, looking at the process that Scotland would have to go through and what it would mean for its relationship with the rest of the UK. So, I mean, I think if the main thing to say is that if Scotland did leave the UK through a sort of legally, constitutionally recognised route, so if the UK government agrees for it to hold a second independence referendum and then it votes to leave and the UK government recognises that, then I don't think the EU would have a problem with Scotland joining. It would have to meet the criteria that all applicant countries need to meet. So you have to be able to have the institutions to implement the EU rulebook. They would have to be an independent sovereign state. So I think the key challenge for Scotland, if it voted independence, is how it would negotiate its separation from the UK, which it would have to do first before it then applied to join the EU. And that, I think, is actually its biggest obstacle, because to be an independent state, you have to have all the relevant institutions. And although we have got a Scottish government, they aren't in control of all of their own laws. You'd have to build up, a foreign service. You'd have to apply to the World Trade Organization to apply as an independent member. You'd have to build up capability and capacity within the administrations. So it wouldn't be a simple process. But then, as I say, what you do is you apply under Article 49. You then negotiate the terms of application with EU member states. The key thing that I would raise, and the problem that Scotland now has, because of the decision the UK government made about the type of Brexit we have, the border we just discussed going from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, you'd have to apply those exact rules to any goods moving between England and Scotland. So you'd then have a hard border there, you'd have regulatory checks, you'd have customs requirements. And the one thing that we have seen through the Brexit negotiations is the EU is not willing to do anything that might undermine the integrity of the single market. So the challenge that the SNP now have, the Nationalist Party in Scotland, is that back in 2014, they were able to say, well, we'll apply to join the EU, and then we'll all be in the EU together. So free movement of people and goods, it will all be fine. Now they're going to have to come up with a plan about what they're actually willing to do about that border. And remember that some farms straddle that border. I mean, it's a lot of people and goods move between England and Scotland all the time. So it will not be straightforward at all. And that, I think, is going to be probably the biggest problem and challenge for the Scottish government if they were voting, if they wanted to actually leave the UK.
Yeah, I always say this, that having worked in Southeastern Europe and the Balkans, doing the breakup of Yugoslavia, it isn't money that matters. It's your heart and your identity. So I'm not too sure whether that's going to dissuade people from voting in favour of independence. And
I mean, it's the same. I would say it's a similar narrative to Brexit. Ultimately, it's just that the SNP and the UK government are on the opposite sides of it. Where ultimately, I mean, you've made the point about we haven't talked about benefits yet, but it really does depend on how you see things. If you believe a benefit is being able to take back control of your laws, then we have got a benefit of Brexit. If you believe that actually having free movement of goods and people is a better thing to have, then you've got a loss. And that's essentially what will happen for Scotland. It's the same debate: is sovereignty worth additional costs? And I think that's a sort of, each person has to make their own mind up on that, really.
Right, we've got Maddy just left with us for just a few more minutes, so I'm going to come back for a couple of more follow-up questions. And Simon, you're still there with us. Just a few thoughts before Maddy goes, Simon.
I think Dr. Johnson said that patriotism is the last resort of a scoundrel, and I
the sound dropped out for me. Did it drop out for you? But I heard that patriotism was the last resort of the scoundrel, which
and that we are governed by a bunch of very deep patriots.
Right, indeed, yes, okay.
Well, as I'm from a sort of independent, non-partisan think tank, I won't comment on that.
Okay, excellent. Well, I think we're gonna to wrap it up there, because I promised Maddy that we'd stick to the hour. So I'm going to say thank you very much indeed for your time, and also to Peter Glanville. Thank you both very much indeed. It's been a really informative discussion. Thanks very much, everyone. Maddy, just as a sort of brief follow-up, anything we missed out on? Any additional thoughts did you have? I know it's complex, it's nuanced, and I think probably the lesson for me is that there's so much more to come, and we're in this sort of slightly this vacuum period where a lot of these regulations, a lot of these checks, the customs checkpoints haven't been built. I mean, there's sort of a budget of £200 million that hasn't been spent yet on constructing new customs terminals.
Yeah, I think that is the key point, is that Brexit might be out the headlines, but it definitely isn't over. And I also think that, the repercussions, as I say, whatever side of the debate you're on, the repercussions are going to be felt for the next few years. I mean, there's going to be a lot of time as businesses adjust, as people adjust, and also, the impact on the union, which we haven't really talked about. We've briefly talked about Northern Ireland. I know you've got some interesting talks coming up that I'm sure we'll cover that. But, the impact of Brexit on the union is huge. And so I do think that even if we stop talking about Brexit per se, the sort of repercussions of it's just beginning, really.
Well, we'll talk a bit more about that, because I really should have pushed you earlier. I mean, we really focused quite narrowly on the sort of the trade aspects. But I mean, in your what's your short-term prognosis, or what's your prognosis in the long term?
I mean, I can't look in, I mean, today is literally the Scottish Parliament election vote, so we'll find out over the weekend, I think, what happens in Scotland. But I do think that Brexit, it has driven, it clearly has driven greater support for independence in Scotland. I mean, the pandemic has also driven greater support for independence, it's worth saying, because I think devolution has become ever more evident. And I think that, Nicola Sturgeon is perceived to have handled the pandemic very well. So I do think there's a sort of impact on the sort of, I think some of the people who voted to sort of for Scotland to remain in the UK were also voting in favour of Scotland being part of the EU. So there's clearly been a tension there. And it's given Nicola Sturgeon a political opportunity to say things have changed, we want another vote. I think the impact on Northern Ireland cannot be understated. I think that the fact that Arlene Foster, the sort of current First Minister, was actually seen as too soft is quite significant. The sort of person in the running to succeed her sort of position as First Minister, he was the person who refused to build border control posts in Northern Ireland. He's actively opposed any kind of implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. If he becomes First Minister, the UK government's going to face a very difficult choice of, do they intervene and act in Northern Ireland affairs? Now, that's obviously going to really upset the nationalist community. You've got a really difficult political balance there. And I honestly don't know what will play out, but it's worth saying that Northern Ireland will get a chance, the Assembly will get a chance to vote on the protocol in 2024. And if they vote against applying the protocol, then there are 2 years when the EU and the UK have to come up with another plan. And so it's not, the Northern Ireland question is very much not resolved. And I think that definitely, I do think the UK government's response to the EU back in January, February has massively inflamed that. And that, I think, is a real problem. And the UK government really needs to understand and acknowledge the unique situation in Northern Ireland and work very closely, particularly with the unionist community at the moment, to try and rebuild trust in the protocol, because otherwise I just don't see it actually being a sustainable solution. And then you end up back at that initial dilemma I sketched out back in 2017 of what do you do about Northern Ireland. And I think that that's something that, over time could also obviously lead to greater support for a border poll and uniting with the Republic. So I think in both Scotland and Northern Ireland, there's a lot of instability at the moment. And I think that, if there is a majority support for the SNP, a majority government is able to be formed for the SNP, I don't see how the UK government can consistently say no to another independence referendum. I think that that's going to be really tricky. So I'm feeling quite pessimistic. I hope that I'm proved wrong, but I do think that there's a huge amount of instability. And I do think, it's caused by Brexit, it's caused by the pandemic, it's how this government approaches devolution, which is very sort of heavy-handed. There are many different reasons to it, but I think that there's some serious concern about the future of the union.
I mean, Maddy, we were focused, as again, I say we were focused on the economic side of things, but what you're really saying is that Brexit's pressure on the union and how the government's dealing with Brexit is putting real strains upon the union.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's exactly that. I think the way that the UK government is approaching this question is it's a government in favour of the union, but I think it's undermining the union at the moment in the way that it's approached questions of powers returning from Brussels to Edinburgh, Cardiff, to Belfast. The way it's handled that has been pretty poor. And I think the sort of let's say the way that it's handled the Northern Ireland Protocol so far, I think has been really poor as well. And I think that's going to be a real test for the government over the next few months, particularly if Edmund Poots becomes First Minister. I think then it becomes very tricky.
Yeah. Maddy, thank you so much. It's been really, really interesting talking to you. And this last point is sort of,
yeah, sorry, it's blown it all up.
Set the rocket up into the air. So, but thank you very much indeed. We're going to stay on the line just for a chat among ourselves. Pete, I hope you stay with us too. But my thanks again to Maddy Thimont Jack for all her help with this. Thank you very much indeed. Great.
Well, thanks for having me. It was good to chat, and thanks for all the interesting questions. See you guys.